Hello everyone, my name is Karina. I go by Kartsie on social media, and welcome back to my Scooby-Doo 60s AU series for part 1 of Fred Jones. In this series, I'm bringing to life the mystery gang from Scooby-Doo with the help of my best friends. The target year is 1969 when the show first aired, and so far we have brought to life Velma Dinkley and the gender bend of Shaggy Rogers. Next on our list is Fred Jones, who quite possibly is the most difficult and involved costume out of the group to create. Today we'll be making his ascot and his collared shirt. But first, let's discover some of the origins of the character. What is the Scooby-Doo gang if not a reflection of the youthquake? They're meant to, in some way, reflect the people at the time, which is the baby boomers, with this big generation gap between the youth and the adults. We know them today as a group of meddling kids who travel around in a floral land, uncovering mysteries that ultimately reveal to be the schemes of adults. But in the initial concept of the show, they actually were a traveling band called the Mystery Five. In that version of the show, there was 2 characters who later merged into Fred. Those characters were, and I have a hard time pronouncing this guy's name, Geoff? I have no idea, but Geoff and Mike. And then eventually these 2 characters merge into a character called Ronnie, and then eventually Ronnie turns into Fred. So besides names, the character designs for the Scooby-Doo characters also underwent some changes. More specifically, this one image I found of Fred, you can see he actually originally had brown hair and a white collar, and then that later, of course, gets switched to blonde hair with a blue collar. So what I find very interesting about this though is that in some live actions, the 2009 Scooby-Doo The Mystery Begins and the 2010 Curse of the Lake Monster. In those live action versions of Fred, we actually do see him with brown hair. I really have no idea why. In every other adaptation I see, he does have blonde hair, but that's besides the point. Let's go back on topic. So most likely his hair color was changed from brown to blonde to help balance the characters in the show, because if you look at the color story of Scooby-Doo, with each of them, how they're dressed, what colors they each have, is very specific and it helps actually balance each other. And if you notice, Fred with brown hair kind of conflicts with Scooby-Doo, who is mostly brown. So the fact that they were making Fred blonde helps him stick out a bit and help all the characters have a sense of more individuality compared to the other ones. So this color story doesn't get muddled as much. The whole gang is heavily inspired by the characters from The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis. This is a show that aired between 1959 and 1962. No wait, 1963. Yes, 1963. So 1959 to 1963. And it had like a big impact on the way that we have the characters that we know and love today. So very loosely, the main character of the show, Dobie, is the inspiration for Fred, but I say this very loosely. So apart from them both having a knack for getting into trouble, the real similarity lies with their appearance. So for instance, Dobie and Fred both have blonde hair, and if you look at it, it kind of feels like Dobie and Fred are like the same person, the same type of person style-wise and fashion, just set in different periods. So it looks like that Dobie is just an early 60s version of Fred, and that Fred is just a late 60s version of Dobie, if that makes any sense. This actually leads me into my next topic, which is what exactly is the difference between the early 60s and the late 60s. That a lot of things that people tend to associate with the 70s actually starts in the late 60s. So although we see them and they start in the late 60s, for some reason we automatically assume that they're only like attuned to the 70s and that they belong to another decade, and that quite simply isn't the truth. The late 60s starts a lot of the trends that you will see continuing on into the 70s. An example for this as attuned to Fred is that a lot of people think that bell bottoms, that flare pants are only 70s, but again, they start in the 60s. Same thing with pointed collars, it's going to start in the late 60s, not the 70s. So much of the early 60s is still holding on to the 1950s aesthetic. So it's going to be a lot more conservative, it's going to be a lot more well-groomed. Nothing really too funky going on until you get to the mid-60s. So what really shakes the 60s, at least in America and also in Britain, is the youthquake and the British invasion. So the youthquake is happening mainly in part due to the generation gap, because we have this whole new generation of young people who are looking at the older generation, their parents, and thinking that they have basically messed up the world, and they are rejecting their parents and going in a bit of rebellion. So there's a clear separation between how the youth dress and how the older generation dress. Although of course those lines can get blurred because there are youth who can dress similar to the older generation and youth who will dress more like less conservative and more flamboyant. So as we get to the mid-60s, this is the type of stuff that's going on. There are assassinations going on, civil rights movements, and this all is stirring up a big differentiation between the young and the old generations. And suddenly we're having a lot more color in men's fashion. So through looking at through images and looking through video archives, I found that it's really 1967 that we really start seeing a lot of people starting to embrace pointy collars and even starting to see a little bit of the bell bottoms. So by 1969, the same year that Scooby-Doo comes out in television, the style of fashion Fred wears has been picked up by stores and pattern manufacturers. But what I find very interesting about this is that Scooby-Doo actually is a primary source in terms of understanding the time period it came out in and how people dressed. It is a cartoon, so things get exaggerated, but for the most part, if they were picking Fred, who's supposed to be this masculine stereotype character, the whole point that they have him dressed with his ascot and his sweater and these colors, and that there's vintage advertisements from this year with the same look, shows that Fred actually is representing a type of person from this time period. So 1969, there are probably people who did dress like Fred. There's a bit of a mystery as to exactly what Fred is wearing underneath his sweater, and I've even found some very amusing pictures online of people speculating of what he's wearing under the sweater. But ultimately, the way I chose what he's wearing under the sweater came down to the pattern that I actually purchased for Fred. So I made a very conscious decision when it came to the Fred button-up shirt, and that is whether or not to make it long sleeve or short sleeve. So I know for the most part you would go with a long sleeve button-up shirt to go underneath the sweater. However, because of my climate, the threat of heat stroke is actually a big deal. Unfortunately, long sleeves for Fred is not an option because of how thick the sweater is going to be.
Man, that thing must get steamy. I like how it looks.
So Fred's ascot is probably the most iconic piece of his wardrobe. He wears it all the time in the shows. The only time we really see him without the ascot is when we get into the late 90s, early 2000s, when we have this brief period of time where they are updating Fred's look to be more accurate to fashion of the time.
Nah.
But perhaps what I find the most interesting about Fred's ascot is not the color or even the size of his ascot, but rather the point that it's actually being worn inside his collar opposed to outside his collar. So after seeing this, I went back into a lot of the images from catalogs from the time period and trying to figure out exactly if this is actually a normal thing. And in almost all of the images I've seen, from patterns to magazines, the men in these images are all wearing the ascot inside the collar. But besides that, I actually do think it looks very interesting and is a very important feature of how his look is styled. And I want to make sure that this look looks as authentic as possible, and it's just details like this that I hyper focus on to really try to understand a period and bring it to life better. Because how embarrassing would it be if I did this whole costume and I put the ascot on the outside of the neck instead of on the inside, and then took all those photos and realized afterwards. So without further ado, let's split up, gang, and solve the mystery of Fred's costume. Now this is a pattern called Butterick 6013. I don't know if this is still something that Butterick has in their logs as being a number, because one thing I've noticed with like Simplicity and other companies is after a while they recycle the numbers and then these patterns get discontinued. Now you may be wondering, Karina, why did you buy a pattern for a piece of fabric that is tied around the neck? Well, upon looking online and even looking at the back of this pattern online of what the shape of an ascot looks like, I realized, see those tiny dots right there? So I believe there is some sort of pleating that you have to do when you're making an ascot. Now I have the pattern out, and what I've noticed is, yes, there is a detail at the neck that I could not see when the pattern was like really tiny. And I'm pulling from my stash this, it's like an off-white broadcloth. So I'm going to cut a basic rectangle of what the shape is. So on the fabric I just dyed, there is some splotches in a bunch of places here and there. And I'm wondering if I should just re-dye this with more orange to try to get it out, or if I should just ignore it. The side of me that knows that I will never be happy with myself if I don't re-dye it is taking over, so yes, let's just re-dye this whole thing. To put all the markings onto the fabric, what I'm using is some wax paper in white. And what this is that one side has this waxy surface, and if I have that positioned on top of the material, when I go over it with a tracing wheel, I can get dots going along the material so I can see exactly where I need to cut. I'm trying to stay away from the lines that I marked for the pleating that's going to happen with the ascot around the neck, because I remembered that the wax paper I have, the white one, likes to go away when you hit it with the iron. So I'm avoiding those points. Right here I had run a thread marking stitch along the seam of where this is supposed to go so that when I hand sew this opening closed, it's nice and even with everything else. So I'm just gonna hit that with the iron very gently, making sure I'm not hitting the marks. So I had the fitting with Mateo to try on the shirt with the ascot and even the sweater just to see how it looks, and we determined that the ascot is actually a bit too big, even though this is how the 60s pattern has it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpick everything and I'm going to make it smaller. So something awesome has just occurred, and that is I went to the mailbox and the Fred pattern has arrived. This person packaged this so neatly and so cute that I can't even fathom. This is the Etsy shop where I got the pattern from. And let's open this up. Oh, this person knows how to wrap. It feels so much like a present. Here we have the cardboard, more cardboard, and the pant. Tell me this does not basically look like Fred. So the copyright on this pattern is from 1969, which is exactly the year that I'm doing. Okay, so an issue I'm having with this pattern is that it is not the exact size that I need. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up and see what do I need to take in, what do I have to change to get it to fit Mateo. So I'm going through a slightly complicated process where I'm trying to grade down these patterns. I have very little experience with grading down things, so I'm learning as I go. And this is one of the reasons why I picked this project, because I'm trying to learn how to not only manage multiple people at the same time when I'm doing costumes, but also learning how to work with grading up and down patterns. So, quite a bit is happening. I'm mainly to do with patterns. So what I'm doing, let me show you. But as you can see, I've been altering patterns. So I'm trying to transfer all of this mess onto paper. After getting everything onto paper, I made a mock-up and then decided I was ready to go ahead and start dyeing the fabric. Okay, so I went to the store and I picked up some fabric, and I haven't started dyeing the pants because I wanted to get the shirt fabric first. In the next video, I'll talk more about the dyeing process because there is a lot that happened and a lot that went into finding the perfect shade of blue. But for now, all you need to know is that for this shirt, I ended up mixing royal blue dye and aquamarine. Now the collar was the most important part to the whole shirt. It's the whole reason why I'm even making the shirt. Since the fabric was dyed, I made sure to pick areas of the fabric that was the most evenly dyed. So I'm going to go ahead and sew the collar pieces together by sewing a lining over to the one that is interfaced. And I'm leaving where I have my seam allowance here so that at the end I can have a section here that can get folded under on the inside of the shirt. Okay, so on the mannequin, I have just the collar, because I just did the collar so far. I have to do the rest of the shirt that's underneath. But with the ascot tied and the sweater, just to get an idea of what this looks like. And so far, it is like really exciting right now, because this looks exactly like the character I'm going for, and it's just giving me that energy boost to keep going. But I am really happy with how this collar came out so far, and surprisingly, I thought that the the Ascot because I was picked this cotton material that it was going to be a little bit too stiff, but I think because of how stiff it is and then the way it is pleated, that it's actually holding the shape of what it needs to look like perfectly well. Now during this I did have a fitting with Mateo, so as you can see here I am marking the points that have to be taken in and adjusting the shirt as needed. And since I had already had that final fitting, I could go ahead and start doing all the finishing touches. Now for this part, I did take the shirt to the costume shop at my school because there is this sewing machine that has this really nifty buttonhole machine option that works so much better than the one I have at home. So I used that and this very interesting tool which is meant to cut open buttonholes. So I went ahead of myself when I sewn this down in this corner because I actually need this to be open to sew something very particular, which I'll show you in a second. Because what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to turn this into this shape, more inside out, sew it down, flip the corner, and then turn it inside out to get a nice folded edge here, and then I can continue the hemming. So here we have it. And I have to clip it, but basically what happens is you turn it inside out, and then we'll have that clean edge. And then here, see how it's already folding up the rest of the seam allowance, so it's gonna get hemmed? That can get hemmed. And without further ado, here is the finished Fred shirt in Ascot. I really love how it looks. I love the color, I love the collar, and even the bright orange of that Ascot. It just, something about it that really adds a nice unison to the costume. One thing I was worried about while working on this was the white buttons, because I was worried that the buttons would make the shirt not look good because I couldn't find any buttons that were in a matching color because I had custom dyed the shirt. But overall I think that they actually look really nice, and even the design line in the front, which is part of that Prince seam. In the next video you'll get to see what exactly this shirt looks like on my model Mateo, and we'll be building Fred's pants. I'll see you then. The cat's crossing across my porch. Mama, mire el gato.